Before I ever went to college, I had the opportunity to take a home study Bible course from Harold Wilmington. And in that course, he laid out for Bible history 12 basic stages. His books were called Basic Stages in the Book of Ages. But he had 12 different stages in which he outlined all of Bible history. And so I wanted to share those with you because um, no matter what I did in college and seminary after that, these stages stayed in my mind. So they're a real groundwork for helping you from here on out to see the different stages of biblical history. So here are his stages. I might have renamed a couple of them, but they're basically the 12 that he outlined. So let me give them to you. We're going to go through them lightning fast, but you can always pause, take notes, but it would be good to memorize these 12 and understand their basic characteristics. Later on, we will have videos on each of these stages so you can understand kind of what was going on at the time. So these will be the basic pegs on which we hang everything that we do for the rest of this series. All right, so there are 12 basic stages according to Dr. Wilmington, and they start with the creation stage. The creation stage, in his mind, is not just creation and fall, but it is all the way through the Tower of Babel. God is working with the people of this world. Then we have the patriarchs, Exodus, conquest, judges, united kingdom, divided kingdom. Dr. Wilmington called that the chaotic kingdom because it was. The captivity stage, the return stage in which Cyrus lets God's people return to Israel at the end of that 70-year captivity. Then there's a break. So those first 9 stages have to do with the Old Testament, and then there are the 400 silent years, or the Maccabean period. And then the New Testament has 3 stages: the Gospels, the early church, and what Dr. Wilmington called the epistle stage, what I'll call the apostolic age, that's going to end around 100 AD. So let's look at each of these stages very quickly. Again, we'll come back to them separately as we go through this course. But the creation stage includes the creation of the universe, creation of man, the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. It includes the first murder in Cain and Abel, and the flood and the Tower of Babel. The unique characteristic of this stage is God is dealing with mankind. He is not dealing with Israel. He is not dealing with a patriarch. He is working with and revealing himself to the whole world as the world begins to grow. And we watch that sin, when it begins, comes in like a flood. We don't start with petty peccadillo sins. We start with the first murder right in the original family's own family. So the creation stage tells us about who we are as human beings. It sets the stage for the rest of biblical history, and it already tells us about sin and the need for redemption. The patriarchal stage, it's as if in Genesis chapter 11, God turns from dealing with the world as a whole and presenting himself, revealing himself to one man, one family, and through that family, according to the Abrahamic covenant, through that family, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So we see one man's faithfulness in leaving his family in Ur of the Chaldeans and traveling to a place that God would show him. We see him a couple of times head down into Egypt for safety during plagues. Not during plagues, during famine. And so that's the patriarchal stage. The main characters are the characters of Abraham's family: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And then many think that Job fits in this stage as well because of some of the archaic things that are happening in the book of Job. And so the second stage in Wilmington's basic stages in the book of Ages is the patriarchal stage. So we have the creation stage, the patriarchal stage, which is the rest of the book of Genesis. Then we go on to Exodus. There is that period after the family moves down to be where Joseph is, to escape the famine and to settle in Goshen. 400 years later, we have the plagues, in which God is beginning to work in Moses' life to deliver his people. So we have the plagues, we have the Red Sea crossing, we have them wandering for 40 years in the desert because they choose not to believe the promises of God in going in and taking the promised land. Those are going to be reserved, then that opportunity is going to be reserved for the next generation. So in Exodus, we have the important characters Moses, Aaron, and Joshua and Caleb make an appearance in both the Exodus stage and then, as we're going to see, in the conquest stage. So the next stage is the conquest stage, and this is the second generation. So when we have God coming to Joshua and saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Therefore, right? So they get up and they redo a Red Sea crossing with a Jordan River crossing. We have the description of how Joshua comes in and breaks the back of the Canaanites in moving in and defeating both in Jericho, and then coming in the central campaign, then moving south, then moving north, and then giving the land to the tribes for their responsibility of completing the conquest. So major characters in this one, as we know, are Joshua and Caleb, and of course the story of Rahab, which we'll be able to get into in a little bit. So what do we have so far? We have the creation stage, we have the patriarchal stage, we have the Exodus stage, and we have the conquest stage. Do you see? These will flow, and from now on, whenever you hear a message or a reference to Scripture, once you understand where the reference is coming from, you can import all that you know about that particular stage. So if I'm making a mention of Rahab, you will immediately think of all of the background of what's happening during the conquest stage. That's the value of these 12 historic stages. All right, the next one is the judges stage. After they have taken the land, incompletely, but they have taken the land, there begins a cycle of wars and peace, of obedience and disobedience in the land of Canaan. People in this stage include the judges, so this includes the book of Judges. Samuel is the last judge and the first prophet, and then the little book of Ruth fits in this judges period as well. United Kingdom comes next. The people clamor for a king, and God gives them a king. First, the kind of king that we want, that's head and shoulders above everybody else, in Saul, and then getting a king that is after God's own heart in David and in Solomon. So the United Kingdom stage is going to be the height of political and military power and spiritual power that Israel had over its neighbors. So in the United Kingdom period, we have all of the reign of Saul, and then David, and then Solomon is that central figure. So we have kings in Israel, we have wars with the Philistines, we have the height of Israelite power under Solomon, and then all of the poetical literature that we have, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, it's largely coming from this stage. Now, some of the Psalms will be collected over a period of time, and some of them are as old as Moses, and some of them are as new as the post-exilic period, or what we've called the return stage. So, but these collections begin under the United Kingdom period, writings by David, writings by Solomon, and the poetical literature. So there we have it. We have the creation stage, we have the patriarchs, we have the Exodus, we have the conquest, we have the judges stage, and the United Kingdom stage. Looks like we're almost halfway home. After Solomon passes off the scene, his son is not wise. His son Rehoboam ends up splitting the kingdom of David into two parts, the north and the south. 10 tribes will go to the north, and 2 tribes will stay faithful to the south. So they will become in Scripture from then on, whenever you hear Israel or whenever you hear Judah, that's a reference to either the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom. So the kingdom of the north will follow Jeroboam, and that kingdom will eventually fall to Assyria in 721. The south will follow Rehoboam not because of Rehoboam by any means or any of the kings of either the north or the south, but because God made a promise to David that he would never fail to have a king on the throne. And so under the southern kingdom, you will have sometimes a righteous king, sometimes not so righteous. The north never gets a good king. So they slip away into captivity earlier under the enemy of Assyria. The south will last until 586 and fall to Babylon. So most of the prophets fit here. Most of those kings that you remember that were notorious, like Ahab, they fit in this divided, or as Dr. Wilmington called it, the chaotic kingdom stage. Because there is a split between north and south, between Israel and Judah, and they will eventually come to the point where God gives them over to captivity. So captivity is next. It begins with the fall of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar comes in terms of the fall of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar comes in, takes captives, and takes them off into Babylon. What happened with Assyria is Assyria came in. Assyria had a policy of deportation. So when the northern kingdom fell, he deported many of its residents, except the poorest, to other places in its control. And the purpose for that is if you were in a strange land with strange people, you develop a loyalty for the king who put you there because he's your only safety. So the 10 tribes were largely deported, and other nations were brought in, other conquered nations by Assyria were brought in to stay where the 10 tribes had been. And so one of the things that eventuated out of that is the rise of the Samaritans, who are Jewish and whatever nations were moved in to take care of the land by Assyria. For Babylon, this is the time when Nebuchadnezzar comes and snatches away Daniel. This is the time when there is a 70-year exile, when the land of Israel is given rest, and God is in control of his people even in Babylon. This will include Babylon, and then Babylon will fall to Persia during the 70-year exile. So it will be Babylon that takes them into captivity and Persia that lets them return. And so we'll have the story of Esther along the way. The last stage in the Old Testament is called the return stage, and this is that announcement by Cyrus. This is the pleading of Nehemiah to be able to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild the walls, to rebuild the temple, to get Israel to be an independent, though faithful, servant of their overlords of Persia. They get a chance to go back and rebuild, and the nation, as it were, rises from the dead. It is back in the land, and they are rebuilding the temple in order to have sacrifices again, in order to be able to worship and live out their lives in a way that is remarkable in history. So the last Old Testament stage is the return stage. Then there is this intertestamental period that's not, we haven't called it a stage because it has no biblical reference, but this is the time actually when the Apocrypha is written. This is the time during the Maccabean revolt. This is the time in which things are beginning to change, so that in the Old Testament we have a sacrificial system, and in the New Testament we suddenly have Herod's temple, and we have Pharisees and Sadducees, and we're wondering, wait a minute, what changed between the Old and the New Testament? So we'll talk about, in our discussion of biblical history, we'll talk about this period in the middle, and we'll even look at some of the books of the Apocrypha, and we'll see what they have to teach us. All right, so 9 stages have to do with the Old Testament. Now we have 3 for the New Testament. We have the gospel stage, which is simply the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the people that are involved in that are the gospel writers, the disciples themselves, and of course, Christ. So the gospel stage would include those first 4 books, include the period of history up to Christ's ascension, and then we would move on into the second New Testament stage, which is called the early church stage. It's basically the book of Acts. So we have the events of Pentecost and the conversion of Paul, the missionary trips Paul takes, his journey to Rome to defend himself, and people. There's a variety of people that come up along the way, from Peter and Paul to Luke to Agrippa to Mark, Barnabas, Silas, you know the list. So that's the early church stage. And then what Dr. Wilmington called the epistle stage, we're going to call the apostolic age. It's the period that's going to end right about the turn of the century. It will include those church planting efforts of the disciples and other partners in the gospel cause as they travel to share the gospel worldwide. So it describes the missionary expansion. It describes persecution. During this period will be the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and a pretty intense letter writing campaign that gives us the rest of the New Testament from people like Peter and Paul and John. So those are our stages. Let's see if we can go back through them together, see if you can memorize them. Let's see if I did. I won't show a slide. I'll just try to remember them from the top of my head. Are you ready? All right, there is the creation stage, then the patriarchs, then the Exodus, then the conquest, then the judges stage, then the United Kingdom stage, then the divided kingdom stage, then captivity, then return, then Gospels, then early church, then the apostolic age closes. All right, so those are our 12 stages, and what those will help you to do, they're sort of like memory pegs from now on. Whenever you hear a reference to Scripture, you'll be able to, my hope is at least in the end, you'll be able to import what you know about that stage of biblical history. You'll be able to fill in the context to any reference or sermon that you hear. For example, if you hear the phrase, everybody does what is right in his own eyes, that's not a good thing. That's from the period of the judges, when people would sin and then fall into captivity and then have to cry out to God and be delivered. So every man doing what is right in his own eyes is not good at all. And when you hear it, you'll think of all of the tragedy that happened over and over again in the book of Judges. And you'll know what comes before and what comes after events in the Bible. So let's say you're studying messianic predictions, and 2 of them that you're studying are Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, and you'll know because David is the author of Psalm 22 and Isaiah is the author of Isaiah 53. You'll know that one happens generations, is a writing that happens generations after the other one. You'll realize David is written really early in talking about Christ, and Isaiah is coming more in the middle, and so his understanding of who Messiah is will have grown and matured as he reflects, perhaps on what David has written generations earlier. So those are our stages. We'll refer to them again and again as we go through this course, so that you can understand each of these periods, and then we will bring in Israel's neighbors when they interact with Scripture. We'll bring them in so that we'll see the Hittites and the Philistines and the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks and the Persians and the Babylonians. When they interact with Israel, we'll be there to describe their culture, their life, their times, and why they are placed where they are in their interaction with Israel. All right, so those are our stages. Feel free to listen to this over and over again, or just to memorize those basic stages so you know which one comes when, and that will give us a big help for the future. Thanks for hanging out. So our next video then will be the creation stage.